Okay, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about absolute value. Now, absolute value, you've probably seen it before, but you might not have remembered what it is. Um, so let's say I want to know the absolute value of 3. So we write these two bars around it. And these two bars, right here and right here, together mean absolute value. So anytime you see those two bars, what they're asking you is what is the absolute value. Now, what absolute value is by definition distance. Let me see if I can write that correctly. Distance from 0. So it's how far are we from 0. So if I draw a number line, and I'm looking at the number 3, it wants to know how far it is from 0. Well, let's look. It's 1, 2, 3. So it is 3 units from 0. So the absolute value of 3 is 3. But I can do this with any number. So let's say I have the absolute value of negative 3. Well, if I have the absolute value of negative 3, we can count from 0, and it is 1, 2, 3. It is also 3 units. So the absolute value of negative 3 is also 3. So what is sometimes taught to you in younger grades is that the absolute value is a number where it's the opposite. Well, it's only the opposite when it's negative. Absolute value is always, always, always positive. So all it does is get rid of negative signs because distance is always positive. So absolute value of 3 is positive 3. Absolute value of negative 3 is also positive 3. So if we quickly look, the absolute value of negative 8 would be positive 8. The absolute value of positive 8, still positive 8. And this will always be true. The only exception is absolute value of 0, which of course is simply the number 0, because 0 is no distance from itself. It's exactly at the same spot. But anything else, you're going to just take the absolute value. And the same thing happens when you get something weird, like the absolute value of pi is just pi. The absolute value of negative pi would be pi. So it just gets rid of any negative signs that happen to exist. So anytime you're looking for absolute value, distance from 0, answers must always be positive. Okay, so let's look at it when we don't have a known. So let's say I know the absolute value of x is equal to 4. Well, I want to know what x is. So what number could I plug in there where I get the answer of 4? Well, there's a couple options here. Let's do it in yellow. First off, I want to know 4 distance from 0. So let's start at 0 and we're going to count. 1, 2, 3, 4. We could be here at 4. So x could be 4 because it would be 4 units from 0. But there's another possibility. We could count the other direction. 1, 2, 3, 4. And we'd be at negative 4, so it could also be negative 4. And this is pretty typical of absolute value, is you should be expecting 2 answers when you go back and find what x created the situation for absolute value. Now that's not true up here when we're just taking an absolute value, but if you're looking for an unknown, you're going to look at 2 answers, and one's going to be positive and one's negative. We even have a special symbol for it. You can also write it like this: plus and minus 4. So when we use the plus minus symbol, it's meaning we have 2 different answers, one positive and one negative. So x is plus or minus 4. That's what absolute value says. Let's look at some other examples here. Let's say I want to know the absolute value of 5. So the absolute value, the absolute value of x equals 5. Well, either 5 is 5 units, or it's negative 5. So that's my answer. Or, again, you could write it as plus or minus 5. I'd accept either one of these. So either it's this top line or it's the bottom line. Either one would be acceptable answers. Okay, well, that brings up some interesting questions. So let me get a new piece of paper out here. And let's say I ask you this one. What is the absolute value of x such that it equals negative 6? And I'm going to give you a minute just to think about that one. If you want to think about it, pause it. So here's the thing. Absolute value can't be negative. We looked at that before. Because remember, absolute value is always positive. So there is no number such that this will be negative, so this is no solution. So anytime you have an absolute value equal to a negative number, there's no solution. It's not possible to do. Don't waste any time trying to figure it out because you can never do it. And if you want to believe it, well, what numbers could it possibly be? Well, there's 6. Well, the absolute value of 6 is 6. You could try negative 6. The absolute value of negative 6 is also 6. And we're pretty much out of numbers now, so there is no way to get to negative 6 because nothing here works. Okay. The only other time that you'd have not two solutions is absolute value of x is equal to 0. And of course, the answer to that is just 0. So if it's negative, there's going to be no solutions. If it's 0, there's one solution, it's 0. And in any positive case, you'll have two solutions. So let's summarize that over here. If the absolute value is negative, there are no solutions. If it's 0, there's one solution, and that solution is 0. And if it's positive, there's going to be two solutions. All right, let's look at some other examples. Let's make it a little bit more difficult. Let's say that I have the absolute value of x plus 1 is equal to 5. Well, the first thing I'm going to look for is see whether or not it's possible, and 5 is a positive number, so it is indeed possible. But now I got an arithmetic problem, so I got to do something. Well, we said it's two possibilities. Either this thing is 5 or negative 5, because what we were just looking at said that it's either going to be 5 or negative 5. So let's make it 5 or negative 5. So let's say that this thing, x plus 1, is 5, and we can solve it. But we also need to look at the case when x plus 1 is negative 5. So I don't know which one of these it is, but I know it's going to be one of them. So we're going to actually solve both of them. And we're going to put this word or here because it could be either one. So let's solve this one. X plus 1 equals 5. We subtract 1 from both sides, and you get x equals 4. Over here, we're going to subtract 1 from both sides, and now we get x equals negative 6. Remember, negative and another negative, you add them up, and it stays negative. So we have two answers, 4 and negative 6. And that's all you're going to do. So when you have absolute value, you should be having two answers, and the way we do it is we solve two separate arithmetic problems. Okay? Now don't be confused. You could have situations like this. And of course, when you see this negative over here, there is no solution. So you need to stop. There's nothing you can do. Just write no solution. Don't waste any time. None of this is true. So just write no solution as soon as you see that negative over there. Okay? Let's look at one other example where it's a little bit more complicated. Let's look at this one. Absolute value of x plus 1 minus 3 equals negative 1. Now, at first inspection, I'm looking over here at negative 1, and I'm going, is there no solution? But it's different than in our last case, because in our last case, there's only an absolute value on the left, but in this case, I have absolute value with a minus 3. Now, one thing you're definitely not allowed to do is combine these things. You can never combine outside and absolute value. The only thing you can do is separate it into two equations. But what we can do is take care of this minus 3, and we can just add it to both sides. And when I add it to both sides, I still get absolute value of x plus 1 on the left-hand side. But on the right-hand side, I now have negative 1 plus 3, which is 2. And was there solutions? This thing's now positive, so there should be two solutions. And we're going to solve it the same way we solved it over here. So we're going to go back and write it two separate times. So we got x plus 1 is equal to 2, and x plus 1 is equal to negative 2. And now we solve them both. We're going to subtract 1 from both sides and get 1. And over here, when we subtract 1 from both sides, we get negative 3. So there are two possibilities. And of course, if you ever want to check one of these, you can always plug it back in. Let's try 1. You get 1 plus 1 is 2. Absolute value of 2 is 2. And 2 minus 3 is negative 1. And if we try it with negative 3 plus 1 is negative 2. Absolute value of negative 2 is positive 2. And 2 minus 3 is indeed negative 1 again. So both of these work. So the rule of thumb is generally if you see a negative over here, that's a big sign that it's no solution. But it's not the only thing to check for. You also have to check and make sure the absolute value is by itself. If you have anything over here, you need to do the arithmetic first and reevaluate here. So in this case, we're going to do the same thing. We're looking over here and saying, I don't think so. But we got to get rid of this plus 3 first. And now when we subtract 3 from both sides, you get negative 4. And since this thing is still negative, this one has no solution. Okay, so it's not no solution from the first negative. It's a no solution because when I got absolute value by itself, there was still a negative here. All right, you got some practice problems to go do. If you have questions, please make sure you ask.